The stained glass windows of St. Jude's Cathedral practically glowed as the organ hit the triumphant crescendo of the bridal march. Maximilian stood at the altar, his eyes welling with tears. But before the archbishop could speak, the heavy oak doors violently blew open. There she stood dripping in white lace, screaming that she was carrying the royal heir. What followed wasn't a crying match. It was 50 heavily armed royal guards descending on her like a merciless tidal wave. To the outside world, Vivian Croft's life resembled a heavily filtered cinematic dream. She was a brilliant self-made architect from Chicago who had somehow captured the heart of Maximilian Pierce, the duke of a small but fiercely wealthy sovereign European principality known as the Valerian Estate. Maximilian was everything the tabloids promised: impossibly charming, educated at Oxford, and burdened with a jawline that could cut glass. Their romance had been a whirlwind of private jets, secret weekend escapes to the Amalfi Coast, and quiet mornings tangled in the sheets of his London penthouse. But every fairy tale has its shadows, and Vivienne's took the shape of Cassandra Dupont. Cassandra was Maximilian's ex-fiancée. She was the daughter of a prominent French viscount, a woman bred entirely for the purpose of wearing diamonds and nodding politely at state dinners. Their split 2 years prior to Vivienne entering the picture had been notoriously messy. The official palace statement cited irreconcilable differences in future duties. But the whispered truth among the elite was that Cassandra's relentless obsession with power had deeply unsettled Maximilian. She didn't just want to be a duchess, she wanted absolute control. When Maximilian proposed to Vivienne under the glittering lights of the Eiffel Tower, placing a breathtaking 6-carat sapphire on her finger, the world rejoiced. The palace PR machine spun it as the modern love story of the century. Cassandra, however, did not rejoice. The psychological warfare began subtly. 3 days after the engagement was announced in the London Times, a package arrived at Vivienne's architectural firm. Inside was a velvet box containing a silver rattle and a handwritten note on heavy embossed stationery. He always said he wanted a little girl first. Make sure you don't disappoint him like I couldn't. Vivienne brushed it off as the pathetic lashings of a bitter ex. When she showed Maximilian, his face had drained of color, his jaw tightening as he immediately tossed the note into the fireplace. She's just trying to get into your head, Vivienne. She thrives on chaos. Ignore it, and she'll fade away. But Cassandra did not fade away. As the wedding preparations kicked into high gear, her presence became a suffocating phantom. Whenever Vivienne attended a fitting for her custom couture gown, the seamstress would accidentally mention how Lady Cassandra had preferred a sweetheart neckline. When Vivienne and Maximilian went tasting for their reception menu, the sommelier casually brought out a vintage Bordeaux, noting it was the one Lady Cassandra had pre-ordered for the previous wedding. Vivienne was not a fragile woman. She had navigated cutthroat corporate boardrooms and managed multi-million-dollar construction sites. But the relentless invisible intrusion of a woman who refused to let go was beginning to fray her nerves. The true twist, however, wasn't just Cassandra's obsession. It was the unsettling realization that Maximilian's family might secretly prefer the nightmare they knew to the commoner they didn't. Dowager Duchess Leonora, Maximilian's icy mother, had never explicitly stated her disdain for Vivienne, but her actions spoke volumes. During a tense afternoon tea in the palace gardens, Leonora had sipped her Earl Grey and looked at Vivienne with predatory eyes. "You must understand, Vivienne." Leonora had purred her voice like silk hiding a blade. "Our family operates on tradition, on bloodlines, and on discretion." Cassandra, for all her emotional theatrics, understood the assignment. "I pray you have the fortitude to endure what is required of you. The crown is heavy, and not every neck is built to bear it." Vivienne had smiled politely, her fingers gripping her teacup. "I'm marrying Maximilian, your grace, not the crown." Leonora had only offered a chilling, humorless laugh. "My dear, they are exactly the same thing." As the wedding day drew closer, the security around Vivienne tightened. Maximilian, increasingly paranoid about Cassandra's erratic behavior, had assigned 2 royal guards to shadow Vivienne's every move. Captain Henrik, a stoic mountain of a man with ice-blue eyes and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, became Vivienne's constant companion. It felt less like protection and more like a gilded cage. 2 weeks before the ceremony, Vivienne officially moved into the Valerian estate. The palace was a sprawling masterpiece of 17th century Baroque architecture, filled with echoing marble corridors, priceless tapestries, and a stifling, oppressive silence. The rehearsal dinner was the first major event of the wedding week, held in the grand ballroom under a canopy of 5,000 white orchids. The guest list was a who's who of European nobility foreign dignitaries, and a handful of Vivienne's fiercely loyal, albeit completely out of their element, American friends. Josephine, Vivienne's best friend and maid of honor, spent the first hour drinking expensive champagne and glaring at anyone who looked at Vivienne sideways. "I'm telling you, Viv," Josephine muttered, adjusting her emerald green gown as they stood near the ice sculpture. "Half these people look like they're attending a funeral, not a rehearsal dinner. And Maximilian's mother keeps looking at you like you're a tax audit." Vivienne let out a heavy sigh, forcing a radiant smile for the photographers lurking near the balcony. "Just get me through tonight, Joe. Once the ring is on my finger, we're moving back to London. I can handle a few more days of the icy glare." Suddenly a hush fell over the room. The string quartet in the corner faltered, missing a beat before nervously picking the melody back up. Vivienne turned, her breath hitching in her throat. Standing at the top of the grand staircase, entirely uninvited, was Cassandra Dupont. She wore a striking blood-red silk gown that left little to the imagination, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders in perfect waves. She looked dangerous, intoxicating, and completely in control. The room parted like the Red Sea as she descended the stairs, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble. Maximilian materialized at Vivienne's side instantly, his hand gripping her waist so tightly it bruised. Captain Henrik and 3 other guards immediately stepped forward, blocking Cassandra's path to the couple. "Cassandra," Maximilian's voice was a low, dangerous growl that Vivienne had never heard before. "You are not welcome here. Leave immediately before I have you physically removed." Cassandra stopped a few feet away, a devastating smirk playing on her crimson lips. She didn't look at Maximilian. Her piercing gaze was locked entirely on Vivienne. "Oh, Max." Cassandra cooed, her voice echoing slightly in the tense silence of the ballroom. "Is that any way to treat an old friend? I only came to drop off a wedding gift." She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a heavy antique gold signet ring. The Valerian family crest. Vivienne recognized it instantly. It was the ring Maximilian claimed he had lost at sea 5 years ago. "I found this in my nightstand last week." Cassandra lied smoothly, her eyes glittering with malice. "Must have slipped off the last time he visited my apartment in Paris. I thought he might want it for the ceremony." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered nobility. Vivienne felt the blood drain from her face, her heart slamming against her ribs. She looked up at Maximilian, searching for a denial, a reaction, anything. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "Henrik!" Maximilian snapped, not breaking eye contact with Cassandra. "Get her out of my sight. Now!" Before the guards could even touch her, Cassandra dropped the ring onto the polished floor. It landed with a heavy metallic clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. She offered Vivienne one final pitying look. "Good luck, darling. You'll need it." She turned and swept out of the room on her own terms, leaving behind a wake of toxic whispers and a suffocating doubt. Later that night, in the privacy of their royal suite, the argument finally exploded. Vivienne paced the length of the Persian rug, her hands shaking. "Did you go to Paris, Max? Did you—" Vivienne demanded, her voice cracking. "Vivienne, you cannot possibly believe her," Maximilian shouted, running a hand through his hair in deep frustration. "She stole that ring 3 years ago. It's a prop in her sick, twisted game. She is obsessed, she is unwell, and she is trying to destroy the one pure thing I have in my life." Vivienne stopped pacing, looking at the man she was supposed to marry in less than 48 hours. He looked desperate, terrified of losing her. She wanted to believe him. She did believe him. Cassandra was a master manipulator, and playing into her hands would be letting her win. "Tomorrow," Vivienne said quietly, her voice stealing with newfound resolve. Tomorrow we tighten security. If she so much as breathes near the cathedral, I want her arrested. No more polite society rules, no more PR spin. Maximilian nodded, crossing the room and pulling her into a fierce embrace. I swear it on my life, nothing will stop us from standing at that altar. But they had vastly underestimated the depths of Cassandra's delusion. The morning of the wedding dawned with heavy bruised storm clouds rolling over the Valerian estate. The air was thick with humidity and an undeniable sense of impending doom. Inside the bridal suite, the atmosphere was chaotic but controlled. A team of makeup artists and hairstylists fluttered around Vivian, who sat rigid in a silk robe, staring blankly at her reflection in the gilded mirror. The incident at the rehearsal dinner had been heavily suppressed by the palace's PR team, spun as a misunderstanding with a former acquaintance. But the tension in the palace was palpable. Josephine stood guard at the bedroom door, aggressively vetting anyone who tried to enter. Captain Henrik was stationed right outside in the hallway, flanked by 6 armed men. "You look breathtaking, Viv," Josephine said softly, placing a comforting hand on Vivian's shoulder. "Breathe. In 3 hours you'll be a duchess, and that crazy woman will be nothing but a footnote in a history book." Vivian nodded, trying to force the knot of anxiety down her throat. "I know, I have this terrible feeling, Joe, like we're waiting for a bomb to go off." At exactly 11 a.m., it was time to step into the dress. It was a masterpiece of ivory silk mikado, featuring a dramatic cathedral train and delicate pearl-encrusted long sleeves. As the seamstress fastened the final row of silk buttons down her back, a soft knock echoed from the door. Josephine cracked it open, revealing Captain Henrik. His usually stoic face was drawn tight, a flicker of genuine concern in his icy eyes. "Miss Croft," Henrik said, his deep voice hushed, "I need to inform you of a security breach." Vivian's stomach plummeted. "What happened, Durgiam?" A maid found Lady Cassandra's vehicle abandoned on the edge of the estate grounds about an hour ago. Henrik reported stepping into the room and closing the door. "We have locked down the perimeter. No one enters or leaves the cathedral without passing through 3 security checkpoints. I have tripled the guard presence at the doors." "Is she inside the palace?" Josephine asked, her voice bordering on panic. "We are sweeping the grounds now," Henrik replied grimly. "But I advise we move the bride to the cathedral immediately. Once she is inside the secure zone at St. Jude's, it is completely locked down. It is the safest location." Vivian took a deep breath, her hand smoothing down the pristine silk of her gown. She would not let a lunatic steal her day. She would not cower in a bedroom. "Let's go," Vivian said, her voice eerily calm. "Take me to the church." The carriage ride to St. Jude's Cathedral was a blur of rain-slicked cobblestones and flashing police sirens. The streets of the city were lined with thousands of cheering citizens holding umbrellas, oblivious to the high-stakes security crisis unfolding behind the tinted glass of the royal procession. When Vivian finally arrived at the cathedral, the sheer scale of the military presence was staggering. The famous stone steps were lined with royal guards in full ceremonial armor, their hands resting cautiously on their weapons. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral were flanked by snipers positioned on the neighboring rooftops. It looked less like a wedding and more like a fortified bunker. Inside the cathedral was breathtaking. Thousands of white roses cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, and the warm glow of candlelight reflected off the ancient stained glass. The pews were packed with 600 guests, all turning in their seats as the massive organ roared to life, signaling her arrival. Vivian linked her arm through her brother Nathaniel's, who had flown in from Chicago to walk her down the aisle. He gave her a reassuring squeeze. "Ready to do this, kid," Nathaniel whispered, grinning. "More than ready," Vivian whispered back. As they began their slow march down the impossibly long aisle, Vivian's eyes locked onto Maximilian. He stood at the altar in his full military dress uniform, looking so incredibly handsome and relieved that it made her heart ache. Beside him stood the archbishop, waiting patiently to begin the ceremony that would bind them forever. Step by step, the anxiety began to melt away. Cassandra hadn't made it. The security had worked. She was going to marry the man she loved. Vivian finally reached the altar, passing her bouquet to Josephine. Maximilian took both of her hands in his thumbs gently grazing her knuckles. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. "You made it," he whispered softly so only she could hear. "I'm here," she replied, offering him a radiant, genuine smile. The archbishop raised his hands, the organ music fading into a reverent, absolute silence. He cleared his throat, his booming voice echoing off the ancient stone walls. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and in the presence of these witnesses to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Vivienne let out a quiet breath, leaning slightly toward Maximilian. If anyone can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. It was a standard archaic line, a formality. For 3 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of the rain lashing against the stained glass windows, and then a sound that would haunt Vivian for the rest of her life ripped through the silence. Boom! The massive iron-reinforced oak doors at the back of the cathedral were violently blown open, the heavy wood crashing against the stone walls with a deafening crack. The wind howled into the sanctuary, extinguishing dozens of candles in an instant. 600 guests turned in unison, a collective gasp of pure horror echoing through the cavernous space. Standing in the threshold, completely drenched in rain, was Cassandra Dupont. But she wasn't wearing a red dress this time. Cassandra was wearing a wedding gown, an exact flawless replica of Vivian's custom ivory silk dress, down to the pearl-encrusted sleeves and the cathedral train. Her makeup was smeared from the rain, her dark hair plastered wildly to her face. She looked like a terrifying, distorted mirror image of the bride. Captain Henrik and the guards at the back immediately moved to intercept her, drawing their weapons. But Cassandra held up her hands, screaming at the top of her lungs. Her voice echoed with a shrill, hysterical desperation that made the blood freeze in Vivian's veins. "Stop!" Cassandra shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed a trembling finger directly at Maximilian. "You cannot marry her. You promised me I am carrying the royal heir. I am pregnant with your child." The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and heavy with ruin. Maximilian's face went completely deathly pale. He dropped Vivian's hands as if she had suddenly caught fire, taking a physical step backward. Before the archbishop could utter a word, before Vivian could even process the magnitude of the bomb that had just detonated in the middle of her fairy tale, Captain Henrik made the call. "Neutralize the threat." Henrik roared, his voice cutting through the panic. It wasn't a crying match. It wasn't a civil escort out the side door. It was absolute terrifying chaos. 50 heavily armed royal guards clad in black tactical gear over their ceremonial uniforms descended on the woman in the white lace like a tidal wave. They swarmed her from the aisles, from the doors, tackling the screaming, thrashing woman, to the ancient stone floor of the cathedral, pinning down the stolen white silk under their heavy combat boots. The sheer physical force of the royal guard crashing into Cassandra Dupont was a violent rupture of the sacred atmosphere inside St. Jude's Cathedral. The collision sent a sickening thud echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings, immediately followed by the ripping sound of heavy, expensive silk. The flawless replica of Vivian's wedding gown tore along the seams as 3 heavily armored men pinned Cassandra to the ancient floorboards, their combat boots pressing ruthlessly into the delicate lace. She thrashed like a wild animal caught in a snare, her immaculate manicured hands clawing desperately at the polished stone, leaving faint bloody streaks where her nails snapped against the granite. "Get off me, I am the mother of the future Duke." Cassandra shrieked, her voice a guttural, terrifying sound that lacked any of the refined elegance she was known for. "Maximilian, tell them. Tell them what we did in Paris." Vivian stood frozen at the altar, her breath trapped in her lungs. Her beautiful custom dress felt suddenly heavy, like a shroud of lead pulling her down into the earth. She looked at Maximilian. The man she was supposed to marry, the man who had sworn his undying loyalty to her just moments ago, looked as though he had seen a ghost. His face was devoid of color, his jaw slack, his hands trembling violently at his sides. He did not move to help Cassandra, but crucially, he did not immediately move to comfort Vivian either. He was entirely paralyzed by shock. Secure her mouth and remove her from the sanctuary. Captain Henrik bellowed over the rising din of the panicked guests. 600 of Europe's elite were now standing, whispering furiously, some pulling out their phones, to record the unprecedented disaster unfolding before them. 2 guards grabbed Cassandra by her arms, hauling her upright while a third clamped a heavy-gloved hand over her mouth, muffling her hysterical screams into chaotic, muffled sobs. They did not gently escort her out. They dragged her backward down the impossibly long aisle. Her heels scraped loudly against the stone, her ruined white dress gathering dirt and crushed white rose petals as she was forcibly removed through the massive oak doors. As the doors slammed shut, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the cathedral, broken only by the distant sound of the pouring rain. The archbishop, a man who had officiated hundreds of royal ceremonies, lowered his holy book, looking entirely lost. He turned to Maximilian. "Your Grace, how shall we proceed?" Before Maximilian could utter a single syllable, Vivienne moved. She did not cry. She did not faint. Instead, she reached up, unpinned the heavy diamond tiara from her hair, and handed it to her stunned maid of honor, Josephine. "Oh, we are not proceeding," Vivienne said, her voice cutting through the silent cathedral like a newly sharpened blade. "Not until I have the truth." Without waiting for permission, Vivienne turned her back on the altar, the archbishop, and the hundreds of staring guests. She gathered the heavy skirts of her gown and marched swiftly toward the sacristy, the small, heavily fortified private chamber located just behind the altar. Maximilian snapped out of his paralysis and sprinted after her, his heavy military boots echoing loudly. "Vivienne, wait! Please, Vivienne, you must listen to me." He caught the heavy wooden door of the sacristy just as Vivienne was about to slam it shut in his face. He pushed his way inside, followed immediately by Captain Henrik and a fiercely protective Nathaniel, Vivienne's brother, who looked ready to commit treason by punching the Duke in the jaw. "Do not touch her," Nathaniel growled, stepping between Maximilian and his sister, his fists clenched tight. "Nathaniel, please step back," Vivienne commanded softly. Her eyes were fixed on Maximilian, burning with a furious, devastating fire. "I want an answer, Maximilian. I want the absolute, unvarnished truth. Is she pregnant? And were you with her in Paris?" Maximilian fell to his knees. The mighty Duke of the Valerian estate, dressed in his immaculate ceremonial uniform, dropped to the cold stone floor, weeping openly. "I swear to you, Vivienne," Maximilian choked out, looking up at her with frantic, desperate eyes. "I have not touched her since the day I ended our engagement. I've never been to Paris with her. I've not spoken to her in private. She is insane. She has entirely lost her grip on reality. Then how did she get in here?" Vivienne demanded, turning her furious gaze toward Captain Henrik. "You assured me this cathedral was impenetrable. You assured me she was neutralized. How does a woman carrying a supposed royal heir bypass a military lockdown wearing a replica of my wedding dress?" Captain Henrik, a man who had served in elite special forces, looked deeply ashamed. He pulled a small, encrypted tablet from his tactical vest, his face grim. "Miss Croft, we're already reviewing the perimeter logs." Henrik stated, his voice tight with professional failure. "There was a systematic breach. It was not a mistake. It was heavily coordinated." He tapped the screen and held it up, displaying a chilling sequence of events. 10:15 a.m. The decoy vehicle was abandoned at the north gate, pulling 70% of the exterior guard detail away from the cathedral's subterranean access tunnels. 10:45 a.m. The surveillance cameras in the eastern crypts were remotely disabled for exactly 3 minutes. This requires a level 4 clearance code. 11:05 a.m. Cassandra Dupont accessed the cathedral through the Archbishop's private catacombs, utilizing an antique brass key that is strictly held by the royal family's inner circle. Vivian stared at the tablet, the blood turning to ice in her veins. An inner circle key. Someone in your family let her in, Max. Maximilian pushed himself off the floor, his sorrow instantly transforming into a blinding, dangerous rage. He looked at Henrik. Where is my mother? Dowager Duchess Leonora remained in the front pew. Your Grace, Henrik replied cautiously. She requested to stay seated until the disturbance was formally handled. Bring her to me. Maximilian ordered, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low register. And Henrik, take Cassandra to the holding cells beneath the palace. Call Dr. Harrison. I want a full medical team waiting for her. We're going to find out right now if she is actually pregnant or if this is the final act of a madwoman. As Henrik rushed out to execute the orders, Vivian collapsed into an antique wooden chair, burying her face in her hands. The fairy tale was dead. In its place was a nightmare of deception, betrayal, and a desperate fight for survival. The Grand Palace of the Valerian estate felt more like a maximum security prison than a royal residence. 2 hours had passed since the catastrophe at the cathedral. The 600 guests had been unceremoniously dismissed, sent back to their hotels with strict instructions from the palace's legal team to sign heavy non-disclosure agreements before departing the country. Vivian sat in the opulent royal library, the rain still lashing furiously against the floor-to-ceiling windows. She had finally taken off the ruined ivory silk dress, swapping it for a simple black cashmere sweater and trousers. She felt like she was mourning the death of her own future. Josephine sat beside her on the velvet sofa, anxiously pouring a third glass of aged whiskey for Vivian's brother Nathaniel, who was pacing the length of the room like a caged tiger. I still say we pack your bags and get you on the first private jet back to Chicago. Nathaniel argued, taking a sharp sip of his drink. These people are psychopaths, Viv. This isn't just high society drama. This is a coordinated attack. If Maximilian's own mother gave that lunatic the key to the crypt, what's stopping her from putting poison in your tea? Running away implies I did something wrong. Vivian replied quietly, staring blankly into the roaring fireplace. I am not leaving until I know exactly whose blood is running through Cassandra Dupont's veins. Heavy footsteps echoed down the marble hallway, and the thick mahogany doors of the library swung open. Maximilian entered looking completely exhausted. He had stripped off his military jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar. Following closely behind him was Dr. Harrison, the elderly, highly respected chief royal physician carrying a silver medical briefcase. Maximilian walked straight to Vivienne, stopping a few feet away, respecting the physical boundary she had silently drawn. Dr. Harrison has completed the examination. Maximilian said, his voice completely hollow. He gestured to the doctor. Tell them. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, a man burdened with secrets that could topple a monarchy. I conducted a thorough ultrasound and a rapid blood analysis on Lady Cassandra in the medical wing of the holding facility. Dr. Harrison began, his tone clinical and detached. She was highly uncooperative, requiring mild sedation, but we managed to secure the necessary samples. Vivian felt her heart stop. And she is indeed pregnant. Dr. Harrison confirmed the words falling like heavy stones into the quiet room. Based on the fetal measurements, she is approximately 11 weeks along. Josephine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Nathaniel cursed loudly, slamming his whiskey glass down on a side table. Vivian just sat there, the absolute confirmation washing over her like a freezing wave. 11 weeks? 11 weeks. Vivian whispered, her mind racing. She looked up at Maximilian, her eyes narrowing with sharp, calculating precision. Where were you 11 weeks ago, Maximilian? I was here, Vivian. Maximilian practically shouted, frustration leaking from every pore of his body. 11 weeks ago was the week of the European Economic Summit, I was literally surrounded by hundreds of diplomats, cameras, and guards, 24 hours a day. I was nowhere near Paris, and I was nowhere near Cassandra. He is telling the truth, Miss Croft. Captain Henrich's deep voice interrupted as he stepped into the library holding a thick file of security transcripts. He walked over to the grand mahogany desk and spread the documents out. I pulled His Grace's security logs from that exact time frame. We track his every movement via GPS and security detail. Henrich pointed to a printed timeline, tapping his massive finger against the dates. The summit timeline, 11 weeks prior. Monday to Wednesday. Duke Maximilian was presiding over the open sessions in the Parliament building, heavily televised. Thursday, a closed-door meeting with the German Chancellor from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Friday, a state dinner with 300 attendees directly followed by a flight back to the Valerian estate on the royal jet accompanied by Vivian herself. Vivian reviewed the timeline. She remembered that Friday. She remembered meeting him at the airstrip. It was impossible for him to have slipped away to impregnate Cassandra. So if Maximilian isn't the father, Josephine said slowly, connecting the horrifying dots, who is, before anyone could answer, the library doors flew open once again. This time, it was Dowager Duchess Leonora. She did not look like a woman whose son's wedding had just been violently destroyed. She looked entirely composed, dressed in a sharp silver gown, her expression an impenetrable mask of aristocratic disdain. This amateur investigation is a waste of palace resources, Leonora announced, gliding into the room with terrifying elegance. Cassandra is clearly suffering from a severe psychological break. She is fixated on my son and fabricated a fantasy. Dr. Harrison, you will arrange for her to be transferred to a discreet psychiatric facility in Switzerland immediately. This scandal ends tonight. It doesn't end tonight, Mother. Maximilian snarled, stepping into her path. Not until you explain how she bypassed military security with a royal catacomb key. Leonora didn't flinch. She simply looked at her son as if he were a disappointing child throwing a tantrum. I have no idea what you are talking about, Maximilian. Keys are misplaced by the staff constantly. Do not attempt to shift the blame for your past indiscretions onto me. Vivian stood up from the velvet sofa. The shock had completely burned away, replaced by a cold, searing fury. She walked slowly toward the Dowager Duchess, ignoring the warning look from her brother. You did it. Vivian said, her voice eerily calm, stating a fact rather than asking a question. You hate me. You have hated me since the moment Maximilian introduced us. You couldn't legally stop the marriage, so you orchestrated this entire spectacle to publicly humiliate me and force the wedding to collapse. Leonora let out a dry, patronizing laugh. You have a vivid imagination, Miss Croft. Perhaps that makes you a good architect, but it makes you a terrible investigator. I don't need imagination, Vivian countered, stepping so close to the Dowager Duchess that she could smell her overpowering rose perfume. I just need DNA. Vivian turned back to Dr. Harrison. You took her blood. You have her DNA on file now. Run it against the royal database. If she's telling the truth about carrying a royal heir, the paternity test will prove it. If it doesn't match Maximilian, it has to match someone else in this family. Dr. Harrison paled his eyes, darting nervously toward Leonora. Miss Croft running a full genomic sequence on the royal database without explicit consent from the reigning duke is highly irregular. Do it! Maximilian commanded, instantly, his voice cracking like a whip. Run the damn test, Harrison. I want the results in an hour. For the first time since she had entered the room, a microscopic crack appeared in Dowager Duchess Leonora's perfect facade. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes flashed with a brief, uncontrollable panic. It was a fleeting reaction, but Vivian saw it. And in that singular moment, she knew exactly what was happening. Cassandra wasn't lying about being pregnant with royal blood. She was just lying about which royal. The crown is heavy, and not every neck is built to bear it. Leonora had warned her in the garden weeks ago. Suddenly, a new horrifying realization dawned on Vivian. Maximilian wasn't the only male in the royal bloodline. There was someone else. Someone who had been banished from the estate 3 years ago for attempting a financial coup against the family. Someone who despised Maximilian and coveted the throne above all else. Lord Frederick, Maximilian's exiled cousin. If Lord Frederick had secretly fathered a child with Cassandra, and if they could somehow frame Maximilian for abandoning a pregnant royal bride, the public outcry would be enough to trigger a constitutional crisis. The Parliament could force Maximilian to abdicate, leaving the throne wide open for the next male heir in line. "Henrik," Vivienne said sharply, breaking the tense silence. "Where is Lord Frederick currently residing?" "Sausam." Captain Henrik's head snapped up from the security files, his ice-blue eyes widening as he processed the implication of her question. "Lord Frederick was exiled to a private estate in Paris, Miss Croft." The room plunged into an absolute deafening silence. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together. The fake dress, the smuggled key, the perfectly timed interruption. It wasn't just the desperate act of a jealous ex-girlfriend. It was a highly coordinated, ruthlessly executed coup d'etat. And Dowager Duchess Leonora was standing right in the middle of it. The name Lord Frederick hung in the opulent air of the royal library like a toxic cloud. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal threatened to crack the very foundation of the Valerian estate. Maximilian stood frozen, staring at his mother, the Dowager Duchess Leonora, as the pieces of the horrifying puzzle finally interlocked. Frederick was Maximilian's first cousin, a man whose ambition was only outweighed by his malice. 3 years ago, Frederick had been caught attempting to siphon millions from the Sovereign Wealth Fund to finance a private militia. The Parliament had demanded his head, but Maximilian, showing a mercy he now profoundly regretted, had commuted the sentence to permanent exile. Frederick was sent to Paris stripped of his titles, and his allowance ordered never to return to the principality. Paris. Maximilian whispered the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. He took a slow, menacing step toward his mother. Cassandra didn't just accidentally run into him. This was planned. You planned this with him, didn't you, Mother? You despised my choice of a bride so intensely that you conspired with a convicted traitor to destroy my wedding and destabilize my reign. Leonora's mask of aristocratic indifference finally began to slip. Her posture remained rigidly straight, but a faint tremor betrayed the sudden sharp spike of her heartbeat. She gripped the silver handle of her walking cane, her knuckles turning bone white under the harsh chandelier light. "You are hysterical, Maximilian." Leonora snapped, her voice carrying the sharp cutting edge of a desperate woman. "You are letting this American parvenu poison your mind against your own flesh and blood. I am your mother. I have spent my entire life protecting this family's legacy from vultures and opportunists." Vivienne did not back down. The terror that had gripped her at the altar had entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. She stepped up beside Maximilian, her presence a silent, unbreakable wall of support. Protecting the legacy by installing a criminal on the throne? Vivienne asked, her tone dripping with biting sarcasm. "If Frederick takes power, you remain the power behind the throne. You couldn't control Maximilian anymore, not once I came into the picture. I was a threat to your absolute authority, so you found someone who was desperate enough to do your bidding." Nathaniel, standing near the mahogany bar, let out a low whistle. "She's right. It's a classic palace coup. But they needed a catalyst to force the Parliament to vote no confidence in Maximilian. A pregnant, abandoned noble bride crashing a royal wedding. It's the perfect tabloid scandal to trigger an abdication." Captain Henrik. Maximilian ordered, not taking his eyes off his mother. "I want a complete lockdown of the Dowager Duchess's private quarters. Confiscate all her communication devices. No one enters, no one leaves. If she attempts to contact Paris, I want it intercepted immediately." "You cannot do this to me!" Leonora shrieked, finally abandoning her icy composure. "I am the Dowager Duchess. I demand respect." "You lost my respect the moment you unlocked the catacombs for a madwoman wearing a replica of my fiancé's dress." Maximilian roared back, his voice echoing violently off the towering bookshelves. "Take her away, Henrik." As two heavily armed royal guards stepped forward and escorted a furious swearing Leonora out of the library, the heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. Maximilian turned to Vivienne, his shoulders finally slumping. He looked utterly defeated, a man who had just watched his entire familial foundation crumble to dust. "Vivienne," he started, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "I am so incredibly sorry. I brought you into this snake pit. I promised to protect you, and I failed." Vivienne crossed the Persian rug and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a fierce, grounding embrace. "You didn't fail me, Max. We are surviving this together, but we need absolute proof before we take this to the Parliament. We need Dr. Harrison's results." As if summoned by her words, the library door cracked open softly. Dr. Harrison slipped into the room clutching a sealed white envelope. He looked exhausted, the weight of the monarchy's secrets visibly aging him. "The rapid genomic sequencer has completed the analysis." Dr. Harrison announced, his voice barely above a whisper. He walked over to the grand mahogany desk and placed the envelope down, stepping back as if it were a live grenade. Maximilian grabbed the envelope, ripping it open with shaking hands. He pulled out the crisp white medical document, his eyes scanning the dense columns of genetic markers and scientific jargon until he reached the final bolded conclusion at the bottom of the page. Paternity and royal bloodline analysis. Subject A, fetal DNA positive for Valyrian estate hereditary markers. Subject B, Duke Maximilian, 0.00% probability of paternity. Subject C, Lord Frederick. Archival DNA, 99.99% probability of paternity. Maximilian let out a sharp, breathless laugh, slamming the paper onto the desk. "It's him. It's Frederick. He's the father." Josephine practically collapsed onto the velvet sofa, in relief fanning herself with a decorative throw pillow. "Oh, thank God. For a second there, I thought we were going to need a much better lawyer." Vivienne picked up the document, staring at the undeniable proof. The relief was instantaneous, but it was quickly shadowed by a grim reality. "We have the proof, Max. But Cassandra is still sitting in a holding cell, entirely convinced that she is going to be the next Duchess. If she testifies that you are the father, the tabloids will run with it regardless of what the science says. She will drag this out in the courts for years." Maximilian's jaw tightened. "Then we need to break her. We need a full confession on tape before the press catches wind of what actually happened at the cathedral." "No," Vivienne said, her voice turning dangerously cold. "I need to break her. She tried to steal my life. She wore my dress. She looked me in the eye and tried to destroy my future. I am going down to those cells." Maximilian looked at her, seeing the terrifying, beautiful steel in her eyes. He nodded once. "I'm coming with you." The subterranean holding cells beneath the Valyrian palace were a jarring contrast to the opulent luxury above. Modernized with sleek titanium bars, blinding fluorescent lights, and state-of-the-art surveillance, it was a sterile, unforgiving environment designed to break the spirit. Vivienne descended the spiral stone staircase, her black cashmere sweater contrasting sharply with the cold gray concrete of the walls. Maximilian walked closely beside her, his presence a heavy, intimidating shadow. Captain Henrik led the way, his boots echoing sharply in the damp subterranean air. "She has been pacing the cell for the last hour," Henrik reported in a low murmur as they approached the high-security corridor. "She continues to demand a royal audience and insists on being addressed as Her Grace." "We'll see about that," Vivienne replied, her tone completely devoid of empathy. They reached the end of the corridor, stopping in front of cell 4. The heavy titanium door featured a small, reinforced glass viewing window. Henrik punched a code into the digital keypad, and the heavy door slid open with a sharp hydraulic hiss. Cassandra Dupont whipped around, her eyes wide and manic. She was a horrifying sight. The ruined, muddy remains of the fake wedding dress clung to her frame in filthy tatters. Her dark hair was wildly tangled, and the heavy rain had washed away her meticulous makeup, leaving her pale face looking hollow and desperate. For Maximilian. Cassandra gasped, immediately rushing toward the threshold, only to be stopped by the invisible barrier of the doorway. She reached her hands out pleadingly. You came. I knew you would come to your senses. Tell these brutes to release me at once. We have a child to think about. Maximilian did not speak. He stepped to the side, allowing Vivian to step directly into Cassandra's line of sight. The moment Cassandra saw Vivian, her entire demeanor violently shifted. The desperate affection warped into raw, unadulterated hatred. She curled her lips, sneering at the American architect who had stolen her crown. What is she doing here? Cassandra hissed, pointing a trembling, dirt-stained finger at Vivian. Get her out of my sight. She has no business in royal family matters. I am making it my business, Cassandra. Vivian stated, her voice shockingly calm, echoing slightly in the sterile concrete room. She stepped inside the cell, completely unafraid of the cornered woman. You are nothing, Cassandra screamed, taking a threatening step forward, her ruined silk skirts dragging across the floor. You are a commoner playing dress-up. I am carrying the true heir to the Valyrian estate. Frederick promised me that once Maximilian was removed, we would rule together. I will be the Duchess, and you will be nothing but a forgotten mistake. The confession tumbled from her lips in a hysterical rush, bouncing off the walls and directly into the hidden microphones recording every syllable. Vivian actually smiled. It was a cold, pitying smile that made Cassandra freeze in her tracks. Frederick promised you. Vivian repeated slowly, savoring the destruction she was about to unleash. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded medical document. Frederick promised you a crown. But did he promise you the truth? Cassandra's manic confidence faltered. She eyed the paper suspiciously. What is that? This, Vivian said, unfolding the crisp white page, is the result of your mandatory medical examination, specifically the DNA paternity analysis conducted by Dr. Harrison. It proves Maximilian is the father, Cassandra shouted, desperately trying to maintain her delusion. The public will see it. The Parliament will see it. It proves, Vivian corrected sharply, stepping closer, that you are carrying Lord Frederick's child. It proves a 99.99% genetic match to a convicted criminal and a banished exile. Cassandra blinked, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Yes, Frederick's child, the true heir. Once the scandal breaks, Maximilian will be forced to abdicate, and Frederick will return to claim the throne with me by his side. The Dowager Duchess guaranteed it. Vivian shook her head slowly, almost marveling at the sheer depth of the woman's manipulation. Cassandra, you really are incredibly naive. Did Frederick forget to mention his current domestic situation in Paris? Cassandra's brow furrowed in deep, panicked confusion. What are you talking about? Maximilian finally stepped forward, his voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth for the woman he once almost married. Frederick was married 6 months ago, Cassandra, to the daughter of a prominent Russian oligarch. He secured a massive fortune to fund his debts. He has no intention of marrying you. You are a mistress, a pawn. You were never going to be the Duchess. The words struck Cassandra with the physical force of a freight train. She stumbled backward, her ruined dress tangling around her legs until her back hit the cold concrete wall. No! Cassandra whispered, her eyes darting frantically between Vivian and Maximilian. No, you're lying. He loves me. We planned this together. The dress, the key, the timing at the altar. He said it would make me a legend. He used you to do his dirty work, Vivian said, delivering the final crushing blow. And Leonora used you to ruin my wedding. They didn't want you on the throne, Cassandra. They just wanted Maximilian off it. You were entirely disposable to them. And now you are going to prison for treason while Frederick stays comfortably in Paris with his billionaire wife. A horrifying, guttural wail ripped from Cassandra's throat. It was the sound of a complete psychological collapse. She slid down the concrete wall, burying her face in her hands, her hysterical sobs echoing violently through the subterranean cell block. The delusion had shattered, leaving nothing but the brutal, devastating truth. Vivian stood over her for a long moment, watching the woman who had terrorized her for months finally break. There was no joy in it, only a grim, necessary closure. She turned on her heel and walked out of the cell. Maximilian signaled to Henrik to lock down the door. "We have the confession on tape." Vivienne said, her voice steady as they walked back down the corridor. "Send it to the Parliament. Send the DNA results. Arrest Leonora for conspiracy." And then Vivienne stopped at the bottom of the staircase, looking up at Maximilian, her eyes softening for the first time all day. And then Vivienne finished softly, "You are going to marry me." The torrential storm that had battered the Valerian estate all day finally broke just before midnight, leaving behind a chilling, heavy silence that settled over the palace grounds. But inside the Grand Council chamber, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. The emergency session of the Parliament had been convened in absolute secrecy. The massive circular room, lined with centuries-old oak paneling and illuminated by low-hanging crystal chandeliers, was filled with the Principality's highest-ranking officials, ministers, and legal advisors. Maximilian stood at the head of the long mahogany table, still wearing his dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, his military jacket discarded hours ago. He looked every inch the formidable ruler his people needed, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. Beside him sat Vivienne, her posture impeccable, radiating a quiet, dangerous strength. She had refused to wait in the royal apartments. She had been the target of this coup, and she was going to watch it be dismantled piece by piece. Prime Minister Winston, a seasoned politician with sharp gray eyes and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, finished reading the transcribed confession obtained from the holding cells. He carefully placed the printed document onto the table, adjusting his spectacles before looking up at the Duke. "The audio recordings corroborate the transcript entirely. Your Grace." Prime Minister Winston stated, his voice grave, echoing in the cavernous chamber. "Furthermore, Dr. Harrison's genetic analysis is indisputable. Lord Frederick orchestrated a deliberate attempt to subvert the royal succession, utilizing Cassandra Dupont as his vessel and his pawn. This is high treason, plain and simple." A murmur of shocked agreement rippled through the gathered ministers. "We have already contacted the authorities in Paris." Winston continued tapping a thick file folder. "Lord Frederick's diplomatic immunity has been retroactively revoked by this council. We forwarded the evidence of his ongoing financial frauds, along with this conspiracy, directly to Interpol. French authorities raided his Parisian estate 20 minutes ago. He is currently in custody, and his new father-in-law is reportedly demanding an immediate annulment. Frederick will never see the outside of a prison cell again." Vivienne allowed herself a small, deeply satisfying exhale. The ghost of Lord Frederick, the unseen puppet master who had tried to destroy her future, was finally neutralized. But there was still one massive, towering problem left in the room, or rather, waiting just outside it. "And my mother?" Maximilian asked, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. The heavy double doors at the back of the chamber swung open. Captain Henrik, flanked by 4 heavily armed guards in full tactical gear, escorted Dowager Duchess Leonora into the room. She was no longer wearing her immaculate silver gown. She had been forced to change into a plain, unadorned gray shift dress stripped of her ancestral jewels and her royal sash. Yet she walked with her chin held high, clinging fiercely to the tattered remnants of her superiority. Leonora stopped at the opposite end of the mahogany table, glaring at her son and the woman sitting beside him. "This is an illegal tribunal," Leonora announced, her voice dripping with aristocratic disdain, though a slight tremor in her hands betrayed her mounting panic. "I am the Dowager Duchess. I demand legal counsel, and I demand this ridiculous charade be brought to an immediate halt." Maximilian did not shout. He did not lose his temper. The absolute coldness in his eyes was infinitely more devastating than any explosion of rage. "There is no charade, mother," Maximilian replied slowly, resting his hands flat on the polished wood. "Cassandra confessed everything. We know you provided the catacomb key. We know you coordinated the security breach. You conspired with an exiled traitor to orchestrate a public scandal designed to force my abdication. You were willing to tear this country apart to humiliate me, all because you could not stomach the thought of a commoner sitting on the throne. Leonora's eyes narrowed into venomous slits. She looked directly at Vivian, abandoning all pretense. She is a parasite, an American architect with no lineage, no breeding, and no understanding of the sacrifices required to maintain a dynasty. I was protecting our bloodline. I was protecting you, Maximilian. You were protecting your own obsolete power. Vivian interrupted, her voice ringing out clear and steady. She stood up, commanding the room with a natural, effortless authority that Leonora had never possessed. You thought because I wasn't born into a title, I would be weak. You thought I would crumble at the first sign of public embarrassment. But you fundamentally misunderstood me, Leonora. I build skyscrapers from the ground up. I know exactly how to handle immense pressure. And I know exactly how to demolish a rotten foundation. The ministers watched in stunned, awestruck silence as Vivian effectively dismantled the Dowager Duchess with her words. Prime Minister Winston cleared his throat, breaking the heavy tension. By decree of this emergency council, and with the full backing of the reigning Duke Leonora Valerian, is hereby stripped of all royal titles, privileges, and stipends. You are banished from the Valerian estate and all sovereign territories. You will be relocated to the solitary confinement wing of the Blackwood, pardon the Northern Alpine Monastery, where you will live out the remainder of your days in absolute isolation. You will have no access to the press, no access to wealth, and no contact with the outside world. Leonora's face drained of all color. The haughty defiance finally shattered, replaced by a raw, gaping horror. Maximilian, you cannot do this. I gave you life. I am your mother. You ceased being my mother the moment you plotted to destroy my family, Maximilian said, turning his back on her. Captain Henrik, remove her from my sight. As the guards closed in, Leonora began to scream, thrashing wildly, completely abandoning her lifelong commitment to dignified composure. The sound of her hysterical protests faded down the long marble corridors until the heavy doors clicked shut, leaving the council chamber in absolute victorious silence. The coup was dead. The treason had been excised. The crown and their future was finally secure. 3 days later, the world outside the palace walls was still buzzing with wild, carefully contained rumors. The official press release from the Valerian PR department stated that the wedding at St. Jude's Cathedral had been temporarily postponed due to an unforeseen medical emergency involving a distressed member of the public. The tabloids speculated endlessly, but the ironclad non-disclosure agreement signed by the guests held firm. The truth of the failed coup Cassandra's pregnancy and Leonora's banishment remained securely locked within the palace vaults. But inside the sprawling glass conservatory of the royal gardens, a very different narrative was unfolding. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden, ethereal glow through the thousands of glass panes. The conservatory was overflowing with lush greenery, climbing vines, and hundreds of vibrant, blooming lilies. There were no 600 elite guests. There were no foreign dignitaries. There were no heavily armed snipers on the roof, and there was no suffocating weight of royal expectation. There was only a small, intimate circle of 15 people. Josephine stood near the front, wiping away happy tears with a lace handkerchief. Nathaniel stood tall and proud, a warm, reassuring smile on his face. Prime Minister Winston and Captain Henrik stood near the back, serving as the official state witnesses, their expressions softening in the presence of genuine joy. Maximilian stood at the end of the flower-lined aisle. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored black tuxedo, eschewing the heavy, oppressive military uniform he had worn 3 days prior. He looked relaxed, radiant, and incredibly handsome. His eyes were fixed on the entrance, waiting for the woman who had fought through hell to stand by his side. The string quartet, tucked away behind a wall of ferns, began to play a soft, hauntingly beautiful melody. Vivian walked down the aisle, and the breath collectively caught in the throats of everyone present. She was not wearing the ruined ivory silk Mikado gown. She had permanently discarded the dress that Cassandra had tried to taint. Instead, she had spent the last 48 hours furiously altering a sleek modern architectural masterpiece of a dress she had originally designed for her reception. It was a brilliant sweeping creation of liquid silver and white crepe, hugging her frame perfectly before falling into a sharp, dramatic train. There was no heavy lace, no archaic veil, and no suffocating expectations. She looked entirely like herself, brilliant, fierce, and undeniably triumphant. When she reached Maximilian, he took both of her hands in his eyes shining with profound adoration. He raised her knuckles to his lips, pressing a gentle, lingering kiss against her skin. "You look absolutely magnificent," Maximilian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "So do you?" Vivienne replied, her heart swelling with an overwhelming absolute certainty. Archbishop Montgomery, standing before them in a simple white vestment, smiled warmly. "We are gathered here today not in the shadow of tradition, but in the blinding light of truth and enduring love. You have faced the storm, and you have emerged unbreakable." The ceremony was short, poignant, and fiercely personal. When it came time for the vows, Maximilian did not recite the archaic scripted royal promises. He looked deeply into Vivienne's eyes, speaking entirely from his soul. 3 days ago, I promised to protect you, and I failed to see the danger lurking in my own shadow," Maximilian said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet conservatory. "But you did not run. You stood your ground, you fought for us, and you saved my life in every way a person can be saved. I vow to spend the rest of my days honoring your strength, supporting your brilliant mind, and loving you with every beat of my heart. You are not just my Duchess. You are my equal, my partner, and my entirely unconquerable queen." Tears spilled over Vivienne's lashes, tracking silently down her cheeks. She squeezed his hands, her voice steady and vibrating with fierce devotion. "I came to this country looking to build a life, and instead I had to help tear down a nightmare." Vivienne said, a soft, tearful laugh escaping her lips. "But I would fight that battle 1,000 times over if it meant standing right here in this moment with you. I vow to build our future on a foundation of absolute truth. I vow to love you fiercely, to challenge you constantly, and to stand by your side against any storm that dares to cross our path." "May I have the rings?" Archbishop Montgomery asked gently. Nathaniel stepped forward, handing Maximilian the simple, elegant platinum band. Maximilian slid it onto Vivienne's finger, the metal cool and perfect against her skin. Vivienne took the matching band from Josephine, sliding it onto Maximilian's hand, securing their promise to the world and to each other. "By the power vested in me and by the sovereign laws of this principality, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Your Grace, you may kiss your bride." Maximilian did not hesitate. He pulled Vivienne into his arms, wrapping his hands around her waist, and kissed her with a staggering, breathless passion that held all the relief, triumph, and overwhelming love of the past 3 days. The small gathering erupted into joyous applause, the sound echoing brilliantly against the glass walls of the conservatory, as they broke apart breathless and smiling. Vivienne looked out at the setting sun, the golden light washing over her new husband and her fiercely loyal friends. The fairy tale hadn't been perfect. It had been messy, dangerous, and terrifying. But as Maximilian's arms secured heavily around her waist, grounding her in the beautiful reality they had fought so hard to protect, Vivienne knew one thing for absolute certain. It was finally, undeniably theirs. What an absolutely insane roller coaster of royal betrayal, psychological warfare, and ultimate triumph. Vivienne didn't just survive a nightmare wedding, she completely dismantled a treasonous coup and secured her crown on her own terms. The absolute audacity of Cassandra, wearing the replica dress combined with the Dowager Duchess's chilling betrayal, proves that sometimes real-life drama is infinitely wilder than fiction. If you love this deep dive into the scandalous secrets of the Valerian estate, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories, and share this video with anyone who loves a fiercely triumphant ending.